In the beginning, there was earth. Paradise. An unspoiled sanctuary of beauty. The only place in the known universe capable of creating and sustaining life. Before humans came along, the earth was in perfect harmony, right? Well, not quite. The earth has always been home to chaos and violence, constantly changing through what can be a brutal process of trial and error. We are a product of this evolution. The first and only species so far capable of replicating nature's uncanny power of creation and destruction. Over time, we have literally changed the face of the earth. So much so that the harm we've done seems irreversible. We are told that the earth is dying and we must save it. It's a heroic notion, but it hasn't been very effective in changing our behavior so far.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Environmental News Network. Today we are going to explore the land and the great history behind it. Here we are at the Great Swamp. This location has been home to countless numbers of plants and animals over the years, but that was not always the case. This land, known as the Great Swamp, was destined for a jetport as secretly planned by the Port Authority of New Jersey and New York. This massive jetport would cover over 10,000 acres, costing nearly $220 million. A group led by Helen Fenske took on the task of saving this great land. They set out to convince the U.S. Department of the Interior that the land destined for a jetport should be saved and preserved. Through a series of deals and donations, the organization collected 3,000 acres of land, enough to make their claim for preservation. In the end, the group won the support of the department, and the jetport plans were discarded. On May 29, 1964, the Great Swamp Committee had the pleasure to announce the dedication of the Great Swamp into the National Wildlife Refuge. Almost 40 years later, another activist would take a stand against the cruel nature of humans and their desire to destroy humanity piece by piece. It started with a woman by the name of Julia Butterfly Hill. A company named Maxam had purchased a large expanse of land in hopes to log most of the trees. Julia Butterfly was not about to let this happen. She joined in a tree sit with the Earth First organization atop a 180-foot Luna tree around 1,000 years old. She was determined to stay put until Maxam agreed to resolve to cut it down. Her fight lasted nearly 2 years, in which she never left her perch on the tree, despite the death of a friend who joined her in the sit. Her actions helped establish Headwaters Forest Reserve, which worked to protect forests as she had. With money running low and bankruptcy nearing, Maxam gave up their logging expedition in the area and agreed to protect the remaining trees. Her actions, however, have not gone without criticism. Some say she was a natural hero, and others call her a trespasser, breaking the law. Undoubtedly, her impact on the community was enormous, and her legacy will live on to be followed by many upcoming activists. Both the Great Swamp Committee and Julia Butterfly Hill's actions resulted in positive outcomes, leaving behind a peaceful environment free to thrive and live on for centuries. Were their actions worth the pain and time? Will these actions set a precedent for future protests? The world is full of people willing to protect and defend the environment, no matter the trouble it will cause them. Some are even willing to go to jail to stand up for our nature. They have learned the true meaning of protection and have pushed the limits of the law. Some humans are cruel, but others rise above and prevail.
Logging and jetports aren't the only detrimental impacts humans have caused on the environment. There's also the tragedy of the commons. Late last month, the Supreme Court approved a $190 million settlement between the state of New Jersey and Occidental Chemical Corporation, a chemical company most widely known for producing Agent Orange, which is an herbicide that was used as a weapon during Operation Ranch Hand in the Vietnam War. Since then, they, along with a multitude of similar companies, have used New Jersey's own Passaic River as a dumping ground for the copious amounts of toxic chemical waste. Only now, some 40 years after the production of Agent Orange ceased, are these companies paying the price for their actions. The operations of Occidental Chemicals and other forms like them are a prime illustration of a phenomenon that has existed for centuries, the tragedy of the commons. The term tragedy of the commons was first penned in 1968 by Garrett Harding to describe a dilemma arising from the situation in which many individuals, acting independently and rationally consulting their own self-interest, will ultimately deplete a shared limited resource. Harding used the example of medieval land tenure to describe his idea, stating that farmers, acting in their own self-interest, would let their cows graze day after day on public land, eventually depleting the land's resources for everyone and leading to massive starvation. Chemical companies like Occidental act in the same way, deciding to simply dump their waste rather than muster up the necessary resources to dispose of it safely. To prevent further damage to the Passaic River, the government has made moves to restrict the commons. Of the $190 million settlement, $50 million has been allocated to widespread cleanup efforts, and the state government is already working on ways to further reinforce the restrictions currently in place on dumping. The movement away from free use of common areas like rivers and forests illustrates a growing trend in America today. From the turn of the 20th century through the 1980s, the tragedy of the commons was in full swing in the United States, with a constantly growing economic emphasis on production and very limited government intervention and restriction. Since then, however, we have moved away from large-scale industry, and the government has finally recognized the potential for disaster that the tragedy of the commons creates. This has been Derek Hubert from the Environmental News Networks, and stay tuned because I will be interviewing someone very special.
Thank you for having me on the show. Today I'm here to talk about what seems to be an increasingly alarming issue concerning rangelands. For those who don't know, rangelands are the dry and open grasslands we drive by every day. They are mainly used for cattle grazing, which is also the most common use of land in America. However, the accusations regarding these rangelands and their poor management reached a boiling point in the 30s, when reports came out that as much as 55% of the U.S. rangeland soils are in poor or very poor conditions. The BLM, which manages the rangelands of the U.S., however, quickly denied this claim, saying that the percentage is not nearly that high. In order to pacify these reports, the government passed the Taylor Grazing Act in 1934, which converted these commons into a permit-based grazing system. While this seemed like a great idea at the time, these so-called permits were very inexpensive and easily obtained, which did little to nothing in order to help reverse the damage we were causing to these rangelands. In fact, in 2006, the federal government spent 7 times more money managing its rangelands than it received in permit fees. Poor land management is not just limited to the rangelands, it takes place right here in our forests. The 2 most common ways in which trees are harvested are clear cutting and selective cutting. Clear cutting, while it is the easiest and most economically efficient practice between the 2, increases the wind and water erosion, which causes the loss of soil and nutrients, also prone to dangerous mudslides. Logging is another harmful practice that practically disrupts the habitat and has an effect on the animal species in the area. This process replaces complex forest ecosystems with tree plantations, which are large areas that are usually planted with a single rapidly growing tree species. The most environmentally healthy process, though, is ecologically sustainable forestry, which has the goal of maintaining all species, both plants and animals, in as close to a natural state as possible.
The tragedy of the commons, as Derek previously referenced, is a prime example of a negative externality. Externalities are defined as the cost or benefit of a good or service that is not included in the purchase price of the good or service. In relation to the environment, positive and negative externalities are the positive or negative impacts on the environment that occur after an event has taken place. A prime example of a negative externality is a farmer who grazes too many sheep in a common pasture. While his actions allow his flock to stay healthy and prosper, his decision to overgraze the land is detrimental to the other farmers. His sheep will overgraze and harm the land, which will, in turn, reduce the food supply, and make it harder for the other farmers' sheep to survive. Since it is common land, he bears no cost for overgrazing the land and ultimately externalizes the cost to the other farmers. Another negative externality is something that a majority of the population contributes to by driving cars: air pollution. When we buy a car, we are solely paying for the materials and labor for the car. We are not paying for the detrimental environmental impacts that are caused each time we use gasoline. This lack of responsibility for the cost of our actions causes many people to ignore the fact that the car emissions are slowly killing our planet. This detriment will be externalized to future generations as they learn more about the conservation of resources and work to fix the problem that the current generation is creating. To combat these externalities, many different laws and regulations have been implemented all throughout the world. One example is a landfill tax, which aims to encourage producers to produce less waste and to recover more value from waste, for example, through recycling or composting, and to use environmentally friendly methods of waste disposal. This tax, which will help preserve the current state of our land and encourage the reuse of things, can have an immense impact on the future. Looking back to the example of the farmers who overused his resources, we now move to a segment on maximum sustainable yield. Maximum sustainable yield is the maximum amount of renewable resources that can be harvested without compromising future availability of the resource. Currently, in New Jersey, we seem to have a growing population of deer and bears. To combat this, we have special days of the year in which we allow licensed hunters to reduce the population. While the deer and bears are still experiencing some fast growth, which in theory is when the population grows at its maximum rate, there has been a slow decline in the growth of the population. This is due to the fact that they are nearing carrying capacity, where there is not an excess of resources to be shared, but instead just enough resources to go around. Over the next few years, we should expect to see a slower growth of the population of deer and bears.
Government policies have a big impact on our environment. Let's talk to Pooja Kasnath about local initiatives here in New Jersey.
Hi, I'm Pooja Kasnath with New Jersey Future on behalf of the Environmental News Network. As many cities and towns across the nation grow and urbanize, there have been many smart growth efforts put into place to preserve the natural beauty of the landscape. Smart growth is a set of guidelines for community planning that focuses on ways to sustainably develop communities, including providing a variety of transportation options like the light rail train, whose stops are frequent and centered on residential development, and fostering distinctive and attractive communities with a strong sense of place. A sense of place is the feeling that an area has distinct and meaningful character. For example, the French Quarter in the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, gives a unique quality to the already charming southern city. Here in New Jersey, thanks to the New Jersey Economic Opportunity Act, the cities of Camden, Paterson, Trenton, and Passaic have designated garden state growth zones. These are zones set by urban growth boundaries, which dictate that this land only be used for green space in the bustling cities. These garden spaces also give the cities a sense of place. In Trenton, there has been an increase in green infrastructure that is mainly used to clean water, help prevent flooding, and keep parks clean. Rain gardens on Mercer Street catch rainwater and send it through local filtration systems to be stored and cleaned for later use. Luckily, the city's green team isn't the only stakeholder in this situation, because Trenton city officials are also encouraging the use of pervious pavement that directs rainwater underground, which means that more groundwater will be available. There also has been a great deal of community involvement, as there are now workshops that teach residents how to make their own rain-catching devices and school programs that educate children on the importance of conserving rainwater. At New Jersey Future, we hope that other cities will take after Trenton and make their city a greener, healthier place to live.
Humans obviously intervene a lot when it comes to land management, but let's take a look at some of the most natural, undisturbed places on Earth. Here we are with Asla Pekin, Director of Yellowstone National Park's Heritage and Research Center. Thank you for being here, Asla. Can you tell me a little bit about Yellowstone?
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm here at Yellowstone right now. It's amazing to see how it's changed. It was established in 1872 mainly for the purpose of maintaining timber and mineral resources. The interesting thing is, national parks were originally created just to preserve scenic views and landforms, not really to protect the environment.
So, when did the transition to environmental focus happen?
It really started in the 1960s with the Leopold Report. It basically set stricter guidelines for the National Park Service to focus on conservation, wildlife, and to let the land return to a more natural state.
And how effective has the NPS been in protecting national parks?
Human activity is inevitable, so while the parks are protected heavily, we still have been experiencing issues in recent years. Air and water pollution from outside the park affect the ecosystems, and any development projects on the border can also harm the habitats. Right now, the biggest problem is the increase in popularity of parks like Yellowstone. Visiting humans can damage the ecosystems, especially when they use things like ATVs, which disturb habitats.
Does that damage occur in wildlife refuges as well as wilderness areas?
National parks are slightly different than wildlife refuges and wilderness areas. Parks like Yellowstone are designed to support many people who visit, while national wilderness areas are set aside to preserve large ecosystems and are often roadless, with limited human use. Once a region becomes a wilderness area, all human activities are banned, unless they began before it was labeled. So some mines still exist in wilderness areas. As for wildlife refuges, these are the only lands specifically protected by the Fish and Wildlife Services for wildlife protection. There are more than 450 in the United States.
Wow, that's a lot of refuges to protect, but there's a lot of land that is not included in national parks or refuges. Is there anything the government has done to preserve those lands?
Yes, they've signed quite a few laws into effect that regulate land use. One significant law is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, passed in 1969. This requires that anybody developing a project on land using federal money or federal permits must submit an environmental assessment first. Before starting the project, the developer submits an environmental impact statement, or an EIS, which outlines the scope of the problem, the environmental context, and it must include a few alternatives plus the environmental impact of those alternatives. The NEPA doesn't actually require the developer to follow the plan with the least environmental impact. However, sometimes it does require an environmental mitigation plan before the funds or permits are distributed, where the developer explains how exactly they will address any negative environmental impacts. Other than that, the other significant law is the 1973 Endangered Species Act, which protects species from extinction. And finally, the public opinion matters greatly when it comes to land use. If there is any public concern, developers usually address more of the environmental problems.
Sounds great. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. But thank you for the interview and best of luck with your work at Yellowstone. National parks are a great place to visit, but let's bring the focus back to the communities we live in. Here's Olivia Kingery.
I will describe the causes and effects of the expansion of residential land. Two types of residential communities, the suburban and exurban communities, have grown more rapidly than all other communities in the past 50 years. Suburban communities surround large metropolitan centers yet have lower population densities. Exurban communities are structured similarly while not having any connection to a major city. The growth of both communities fell due to the 2008 recession, but still remain the fastest growing parts of metro areas. As suburban areas grow in size, they blur the boundaries between rural and urban communities, resulting in urban sprawl. Urban sprawl leads to many serious environmental effects. The increased number of drivers in these areas burn more fossil fuels and release pollution into the air. Suburban houses also take up much more land than urban buildings. The main causes of urban sprawl include automobile and highway construction and lower living costs in suburban areas. The invention of the automobile allowed people to more easily commute from outer areas to cities, whereas before they would have had to live in the city if they wanted to work there. Larger highways also allowed people to more easily live in the suburbs while still commuting to the city, contributing to urban sprawl. Furthermore, living costs contribute to urban sprawl as more people move to the suburbs in order to buy larger, more comfortable homes for the same prices as small, cramped city apartments. As urban sprawl increases and more people move out of cities and into surrounding areas, it creates a cycle of city deterioration called urban blight. First, the city begins to lose its revenue from property sales and service taxes due to the decreasing number of residents. Popular stores may then lose customers and go out of business, and as a result, suburban residents have even fewer reasons to visit the city. As the city continues to deteriorate, more people will move to the prosperous suburbs, thus worsening the effects. Government policies have both worsened and reduced the effects of expansion of residential land. One policy, the Highway Trust Fund, pays for the construction and maintenance of federal highways, mostly using money from federal fuel taxes. Creating more highways leads to more driving, and as people are able to live farther away from their jobs, these highways become more congested. As a result, they are further expanded, allowing people to live even farther from where they work. This is an example of induced demand, in which increase in supply of a good increases the demand for the good. As the amount and size of highways increases, the demand for larger highways also increases. Another government policy is zoning, which creates regulations about what can be built in certain parts of communities. This separates businesses from quiet residential areas. Land is divided into these different categories, which all face different rules and regulations. The Great Swamp Watershed Zone is designated to be a special area, as it is a national wildlife refuge whose regulations focus primarily on preserving nature.
Hey everybody, today we have a very special guest from the Trust for Public Land.
Hello everybody, my name is Adrian Benepi, and I am the Director for the City Park of Development, a non-profit organization for the Trust of Public Lands.
Oh, well, it's great to have you here today, Mr. Benepi. Alright, so let's get started. I understand that there are 4.2 billion acres of protected land across the world, but what exactly are they? I'm sure many people don't really know what they are or where they are.
Let me just start off by saying that 11% of the Earth is either nationally or internationally protected by some kind of organization. These are protected lands that are split up into 6 different categories. The first would be national parks.
So you mean kind of places like Yellowstone? Well, if they are protected, then why can humans still visit them?
Yes, like Yellowstone. And to answer your question, it is protected properly so people can still visit it. Now, national parks would be described as a scenic or historically important area of countryside protected by federal governments for the enjoyment of the general public, so people can visit them. And for the preservation of wildlife. These national parks will vary based on their specific historic importances and their climate.
In your report, you say that the next category is managed resource protected areas. I'm sure this is new to viewers watching, so would you care to explain what they are?
Sure. Managed resource areas are protected areas which conserve ecosystems and habitats together with associated cultural values and traditional natural resource management. In other words, protected land areas based on habitat and ecosystem through natural resource management systems. This would be the United States national forests.
What exactly are these resource management systems?
Well, there are a number of things that are specified in the Farm Bill of 2007. These practices follow conservation and management in order to prevent depletion of natural resources, basically managing all the resources that are available to stop from being depleted or overused.
That's very interesting. So, very similar to the prior, we also have habitat and species management areas. Would you care to explain those?
Those would be areas which aim to protect particular species or habitats, and management reflect this priority. Based on the habitat and the species, you would attempt to protect them. For example, in Florida, they have the Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge. This refuge specifically targets the pelicans in Florida, which are on the brink of extinction due to hunting. Each one would be classified based on the area that they are attempting to protect, the habitat, or the species.
Yeah, that would definitely be a very important part to keeping endangered species and habitats alive. So moving on, number 4 on our list are nature reserves and wilderness areas. I understand that those are the most strictly protected areas in the United States. Care to expand?
Well, they are simply areas established to protect the species and ecosystems, but they are classified based on the goal and what they are attempting to protect, and the severity of the issue. This would be why you would see Banner Peak and Alpine Lakes as wilderness areas. If you ever schedule any type of vacation at these locations, you will read a long list of rules and basically you won't be able to do too much.
Alright, so you said earlier that tourists can be in these lands while they are still protected, but how is this executed with national monuments and protected landscapes and seascapes?
Well, those are two of the most heavily visited national protected areas by humans, so regulations will keep everything in place. Protected seascapes and landscapes are areas which non-destructive use of natural resources with opportunities for tourism and recreation are present. So activities that occur at places like Chesapeake Landscape and the New York Seascape do not harm the environment if a large amount of people follow the activities. As for national monuments, they are areas which are set aside to protect unique sites for special natural and cultural interest. These sites don't really have anything to do other than admire the monument, so mainly for tourism. This would include places like what we know as Mount Rushmore, a perfect place where nature and human can coincide.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Benepe. Well, now we know the importance of public lands and what they are. However, there's still much to be done, as we said, only 11% of our lands are protected around the world. This is Derek Huber, signing off.
Thanks for watching! Tune in next time to the Environmental News Network.